Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM, Channel 141. This is the Insight segment. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, we take a look at crime and violence in D.C. Despite the city's best efforts, including a youth curfew and various initiatives aimed at curbing all of the drama, the numbers just don't seem to be moving in the right direction. And tonight, we take a closer look at what the city is doing right and where city leaders may be missing the mark. Are these measures enough to keep neighborhoods safe, or do city leaders need to rethink their strategies? We have a roundtable of experts joining this conversation. We'll start tonight with Dr. Bahia Muhammad, Associate Professor of Criminology at Howard University, and Keith Alexander, Pulitzer Award-winning DC Crime and Courts reporter for the Washington Post. Thank you all so much for joining this conversation.
Good to be here. Thank you, Harold.
Yes, thank you so much.
I want to first start with a few fast facts, and I'm sure you know these, but for the edification of our listeners, there have been at least 15 deadly shootings in the past 2 weeks, resulting in 17 people losing their lives to gun violence in the city. Now, if we look at the overall crime stats so far compared to 2024, we are, as of today, at the same point that we were for homicides last year. 69 last year, 69 this year. So we are even. And those numbers literally changed as a result of the last 24 hours. Certainly, when we talk about total crime overall, it is down about 20%. And certainly those are the kinds of things that the mayor and the DC police chief have been touting in past press conferences. I think the issue, however, is that the numbers are still alarming, particularly when it comes to homicide. One homicide is one too many. What are your thoughts, Dr. Muhammad, about those numbers?
Thank you so much for laying that foundation and giving our listeners an opportunity to have that vantage point. I think we need to come together immediately and begin to have more conversations, realistic conversations around the realities of what we're dealing with. I want to start just by, rest in peace to the 17 individuals who have lost their lives in these instances and nuances, and definitely give attribution to our mayor and to our chief of police for working diligently, consistently to try to work around these concerns and issues. But we have to do something different. I think that one of the things that we lose in the midst of hardship and pain and bereavement is innovation and creativity. And what we're seeing across the nation with the uptick of crime and delinquency, one of the things that I feel has been missing is love and the concept of love, and thinking about the ways in which we can love on our youth, even the ones that we erase and dispel, to have a clear understanding of how did we get here, and using them as a resolve to find solutions.
Let me follow up before I go to Keith, because I'm struck by what you said when we talk about city leaders, politicians, the mayor, city council, and those who are appointed by them, such as Police Chief Pamela Smith. I say this, kind of tongue in cheek. I wonder how much talk there is about love in the police academy. I wonder how much love there is discussed during the city council meetings. And so whose responsibility is it to love those who are committing these crimes or have the potential to commit these crimes, Dr. Muhammad?
Absolutely. That's such a fair and in-depth question. I think all of ours, when we think about what love looks like in policy, it's something that we need to begin thinking about. There was a time when former director Clint Lacey challenged the Department of Youth and Rehabilitation Services to really think about those concepts. I've spent the last 5 years of my research career studying credible messengers and trying to think about what love looks like in policy, how to love on youth prior to coming into detention facilities, loving on families and communities. And one of the things that it gave me a vantage point through an ethnographic landscape was to understand the ways in which, even when we look at all of the press release that are coming out, we are not talking to the young people. We are talking about them. We are talking around them. We are not creating programs that incorporate their perspectives, what they think about, what they feel, how they understand the world. We are only looking at the actions. I think it is incumbent upon all of us, not just the parents, but teachers, university professors, individuals that own businesses in the community, new faces into the community that are gentrifying the community, finding a way to love on our young individuals. And I think it starts in our school curriculums, and then it works its way all the way up to youth employment and summer programs.
Keith, yesterday, DC Police Chief Pamela Smith made these comments during a press conference, and I want you to share your thoughts about this after you hear it.
Mm-hmm. These are not random shootings. These are individuals who have either agreed to meet up at a particular area or agreed to meet at a particular location. And then there's an altercation, first verbal, because we've been seeing a lot of this on video, and then obvious physical, and then the use of a firearm.
You remember when, and this hasn't necessarily stopped, but you remember when there was more talk about the gun violence in the communities being at the hands of crews or gang activity. But the chief is now saying that these are individual conflicts. Your thoughts about this and the coverage that you've done on this?
And right. And yes, I mean, the chief is correct. These are individual conflicts, but these are individual conflicts often within gangs, within neighborhoods. Individuals who live in certain neighborhoods and have a beef with each other. And yes, these are one-on-ones. But here's what's most concerning. You know, the chief is saying that these are one-on-one type incidents. Oftentimes, these individuals are armed with semi-automatic weapons, and they see the person they are seeking to take to go after, and they just spray. And what happens is that innocent victims, and we've seen this, I've covered these cases, innocent victims are killed while they are going after the person they have a beef with. And so to hear the chief say something about that, well, these are one-on-one examples of aggression, does not give a fair indication of that. These are individuals who could also include innocent victims, bystanders who could get caught up in those bullets. And that's I see a lot of those cases. And we all see those cases where oftentimes somebody tries to shoot person A and ends up shooting person C, D, and E, and person A is never shot.
So one of the other things that I think that has come up, and this is as it relates to interpersonal conflicts, and Keith, unless you know more information, the Pitts Place Southeast shooting yesterday was police were saying that the victim was being chased by a man and a woman. They arrested two men, and of course the woman was shot. They did not say anything necessarily about crew or gang activity, but they did say that this was a long-standing conflict. From the outside looking in, I'm thinking that could be because you parked your car in front of my house where I usually park, or you didn't trim your grass, or I didn't like the way that you spoke to my kid. And so do you believe that there is an aspect of the kinds of crimes that we are seeing that have to do specifically with conflict resolution outside of the crew or gang issue?
Oh, I definitely think that. And I also think that the chief is saying what she is saying in an effort to squash any concerns within the community that, am I in danger? Well, no, you're not in danger because you're not part of this beef between these two individuals. So this beef is a domestic beef. And I think that's what she's trying to say. But my point is that anything can happen in these domestic beefs, and I don't think just because it's a domestic beef between two individuals who know each other does not mean that the community at large is not in danger. That's my point, because the community at large could still be in danger even though it's a domestic dispute between two individuals who know each other.
Dr. Muhammad,
I've covered enough of those cases, and I also want to bring up, you talked about juveniles earlier. Yes. I have covered so many juvenile cases. And I have dozens of cases at DC Superior Court. And I have only heard one youth apologize for their actions. Only one youth ever apologized. And that youth, she testified against her co-defendants in a murder case in which she and four other young girls stomped an elderly man to death.
That was the Georgia Avenue case.
Yes, that was the Georgia Avenue case. And these are girls between the ages of 12 and 14 who were convicted of doing this. I have never heard a juvenile tell a family member or anything, say that I am sorry for what I have done. And I'm also struck by that. I have never heard a juvenile testify or explain how he or she got a gun. That has never come out in court. And so it also makes me wonder what is going on here. If you're offering a plea deal, the prosecutors are offering plea deals to these juveniles. I'm often struck that as part of the plea deal, there isn't a clause of, you've got to explain to us where you got the gun. And that's never part of the plea deal.
Yeah, and kind of an allocution. Yes, I'm using my law and order law degree. Dr. Muhammad, what's that about? I've got about a minute. We can continue on the other side, but I'd like for you to at least begin to share your thoughts about what Keith said and what you believe that's about.
It's so complex. It's about social capital. We're seeing a lot of young people that are acting out. They have the expertise in action. One of the things that's missing is the social ability to communicate through emotional intelligence. When you are coming out and you are doing these things, it is for a reason. Many individuals look at the actions. They work toward rectifying the action without automatically speaking to young individuals. With the folks that I've interviewed inside of the detention facilities, they're often muted. They're often traumatized, years and years of trauma and abuse and disregard and disrespect, oftentimes never having a hug, a kiss on the cheek, an individual that tells them, I'm sorry for being on welfare. I'm sorry for not being able to raise you in the way that I thought when I gave birth to you. I mean, it's such a cyclical sort of process, but oftentimes the young individuals don't have the words, don't have the mental capacity to often share in that sort of a way, which is very interesting.
Indeed it is. I need you both to hold on, because this is going to only get more interesting and more important in this particular conversation. So please stay with us. I want to remind our listeners, you can hear this in every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR. This conversation continues on Sirius XM, channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM, channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our conversation about DC crime. My guests are Dr. Bahia Muhammad, Associate Professor of Criminology at Howard University, and Keith Alexander, Pulitzer Prize Award-winning DC crime and courts reporter for the Washington Post. Before the break, Dr. Muhammad, we were talking about what Keith was observing during his reporting in courts about youth who had committed crimes, who had been convicted, whether they had whether they had been offered a plea deal or whether they had actually been convicted of crimes. And when we look at what has been happening on the wharf, for example, at Navy Yard, and the kind of activities, the violence and the crime involving the youth. And I was particularly struck, Dr. Muhammad, about, and look, I'm sure this is as old as Cain and Abel, but still looking at how these children, and they are children, how they interact with each other and why they cannot, why can't we all just get along? Dr. Muhammad.
I mean, when we think about territory, when we think about access to respect, Elijah Anderson, sociologist, talks about this concept called codes of the street. And oftentimes that has led us into these conversations around toxic masculinity and the ways in which your actions show machoism, respect, and dignity. We don't have the fortune of this lifestyle and this perspective now to have strong Black OG and men that are guiding young individuals. So oftentimes you have young folks that are making decisions on their own, outside of their parents, outside of individuals that are connected with them. And oftentimes this leads to what we see, gang violence. And within those areas, there is this sense of love and kind of respect and a covenant that then triggers this behavior and allows it to continue to go on. I think that we need to incorporate these young individuals into the conversation and into the dialogue. I think it's very important for us to utilize our credible messengers, which are individuals that have done similar things to many of these young individuals. They're not going to snitch in court. They're not going to share these sort of things. They're not going to look weak in their testimony so that when they go to the big house, now they become the threat and the individual that is dealt with in ways that are behind the wall. But with credible messengers, we find that opportunity and that concept of snitching is minimized. There's this concept of understanding and respect where these young people are coming out and talking about things that we have just never heard of, things they've never shared, things that their families are not even aware of, that give us an opportunity to take some of those nuggets to make sure that we are able to use it to protect our society.
So when you talk, for example, about those credible messengers, perhaps you're speaking, for example, about violence interrupters that we are seeing in DC. Is that an example?
I think
I was going to say that maybe she might want Dr. Muhammad will talk about who the credible messengers are
right,
and their roles in the prison. Because maybe our listeners aren't familiar with who the credible messengers are.
Yes, absolutely. Credible Messengers is an initiative moving across the nation, and we're finding that it is very transformative in this movement to engage with young individuals. These are mentors, life mentors that are directly impacted and formerly incarcerated, oftentimes of violent offenses, oftentimes similar to what we're seeing happening in the community, have been those same actors that have now transformed their lives in numerous ways and are now on the front line as responders. These are individuals that are not only able to code switch, but they speak the language of the streets and of young individuals and are able to garner that respect to be able to not only guide policy, but guide actions of young individuals, meaning that they are listening and putting guns down. And sharing information that's important. A lot of the credible messengers and the initiatives have lost tremendous funding. And as a result of that, they are not being able to receive training, not having access to be able to afford to engage with young individuals. And I think that is where we're starting to see this kind of uptick. Young individuals want to hear from the credible messengers. And I don't think I saw on any of the press releases or discussions in the community, any of them talking to the young individuals, more so talking around them.
Yeah, Keith.
We should also just point out just real quick, because your listeners will know this, that former Councilman Trayon White was caught up in some of that funding issues regarding credible messengers. So if people may have heard that name associated with former Ward 8 councilperson Trayon White. But I also want to put out just one thing that we haven't touched on is also the mental health. I have been struck by the number of juveniles charged with violent crimes who have mental health issues, who have chronicled mental health issues even prior to their arrest. And the mental health issues were not addressed. Now, we're not saying that young people with mental health issues go out and commit violent crimes. That is not what we're saying. What I am saying is that there seems to be a disconnect somewhere between the crimes that are committed and these young people, and that disconnect could result in or be part of the fact that they have a mental health issue. Again, those 5 young girls who I talked about earlier, who were convicted of beating this 64-year-old man to death, 3 of the 5 had documented mental health issues. And we're seeing a lot of that.
So, and this is a point that I was going to get to, and I want both of you to kind of talk about this, because in the context of what the police department, the Metropolitan Police Department, should do, because traditionally police respond to incidents, although we know that not only the Metropolitan Police Department, but other police departments as well, but let's just stick to DC, they do have mental health training to hopefully recognize someone who is in crisis. Now that I said recognize someone in crisis, and let me go to Dr. Muhammad so we can really drill down on that. Usually when we talk about responding officers who have been trained to recognize someone in crisis, that may very well be, someone who is, bipolar, who may be, may have issues regarding schizophrenia. I'm just throwing out just kind of 2 as an example, as opposed to someone who may be impacted by generational trauma. Those are 2 different kinds of mental health issues, Dr. Muhammad. And just because somebody gets mad and shoots somebody, they may not have a diagnosable mental health issue. They may not be bipolar. They may not be schizophrenic. They may not be but they may have generational trauma that causes them not to be able to manage their anger. What is a police supposed? What is a police department supposed to do, Dr. Muhammad?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a good conversation. Automatically, I think about one of the models that I've seen work tremendously well in Newark, New Jersey, under Mayor Ras Baraka, where there's a connection between social workers and the police department. They actually graduate together and go through training together. Everything that we're dealing with doesn't fall on law enforcement. It does not fall squarely in what they have the capacity to be able to do. I think it definitely boils down to training. Of course, we always can have more training, but who is the trainer? I think that is what we need to get into. Dr. Pratt Harris from Morgan State University published a book called Why Police Should Be Trained by Black People. And it's a very intriguing book. It goes into great detail talking about the ways in which we are able to understand intergenerational trauma across the African diaspora, the things that the body holds that the mind may not be able to capture, the ways in which we are pushing ourselves away from being afraid of young people and leaning into them and loving them. It's a very interesting concept for law enforcement to kind of think about the ways in which they can partner with experts and entities in adjacent areas to be first line responders together. I don't think all of the training in the world doesn't prepare you to walk into some of the instances and the traumas that young people are faced with today. Imagine living in these communities. Imagine, what it actually feels like to be the individual with 3 bodies on your jacket, right? We put individuals in solitary confinement, and maybe that's what we feel is the punishment that will justify, but we have no idea what it feels like to wake up in those bodies, in those minds, to be thinking about that. Is there a consciousness? What does that consciousness think about? That's a lot to be thinking about in law enforcement coming in under safety and security. I think we need to move away from the militarization of not only the schools with young individuals, but also the thought processes around law enforcement, specifically trying to get more younger individuals and investing in the cadet corps, where you have young individuals that are living in the communities, they're closer in age, they have a different vantage point, and trying to get them in and through the system so that we can have their boots on the ground as well.
Dr. Mama, if I just real quick, Carol, if I can just ask a quick question. One of the things again that I'm noticing, and I hear what you're saying, but I'm also noticing a lot of these young people have truancy issues.
Truancy.
These kids are not in school. Truancy is a big issue involving young people who are involved who get caught up in crime. And when you're saying that that the school should do more to identify this, well, the kids aren't in school for the schools to do something about the challenges that these young people are having. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is, if the parents aren't doing something about it and the schools can't do anything about it, then is it a surprise that these kids now end up on the streets committing violent crimes? And I guess my question is, what can be done or should be done on the education level when it comes to truancy, so that if these kids are in school more, then maybe their diagnoses, the psychological will be identified, and the people in the schools can say, you know what, this kid has a psychological problem, let's deal with it. But the kid is never in school, there's no one there to recognize it.
Thank you so much for that, Keith. Ooh, this is getting good. You know, it's so interesting to me, these concepts around, truancy. And we have to talk about the adultification, right, of young individuals and how they are being pushed out of schools. Not that they don't necessarily want to be there, and being pushed out by being invisible and not being recognized. A lot of the young individuals, even the ones that are behind the guns, are very intellectual, great in math, great in STEM, not challenged in the schools. They are seen more by their peers as being fighters and being able to square up, where being intelligent is not being acknowledged. And we see this now at all of the HBCUs across the nation, and Howard University as a Research One institution leading it around the ways in which we have to increase the numbers. 70% of the population on college campuses are males, 30% being females. This ties into early childhood education, where young
I'm sorry. Back up again. Give us those figures again.
70%, about 70% of the population. So if you were a student at Howard University or at the different HBCUs, you see that there are more females that are circulating in the school environment, meaning that there are these positive interactions in primary school and secondary school that lead you to want to go to these higher levels of education. What I'm trying to get at is that we need to think about ways to bring in innovation, creativity back into our school systems for young individuals to be challenged. I don't think that it is their fault for not wanting to find a space or having a space in the school environment, in the curriculum. What are they seeing in the curriculum? And now, wow, a lot of themselves are being erased out of these curriculums that then gives them what to be challenged into the school. What are they actually learning and what is happening there? It really is a battle between the streets and between the academics, and the streets are winning out.
So let me talk specifically from your perspective, Keith, and your coverage. What do you believe is working and what is not? Okay, we can, I'm old enough to remember 400 plus murders a year during the crack cocaine issues of the 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. Again, one homicide is too many, but we're at 69. So what is working or what has changed?
One of the things, well, let's when we talk to police officers, and I'm going to tell you what they tell me.
Okay.
What has really changed, what has really changed is the amount of guns, the type of guns that are coming onto the streets, right? Back in the 80s, those were just handguns, shoot, bang, bang. Today you have assault rifles today. And those assault rifles, young people can't really control them. They're not trying to control them. They're spraying. It's easier for them to just spray. And that goes back to my comment earlier, where they might have a beef with one individual, but because they have an assault rifle, they're just spraying. That means anyone near that individual is going to be taken out, unfortunately. So the arsenal weaponry, that has definitely changed. Also, mental health. Back in the 80s and 90s, the issue was drugs. Today, people will tell you the issue is mental health. And people aren't getting diagnosed. They're not being treated properly. And and as a result of having they're self-medicating, and they're becoming much more aggressive. And I think that's what you're also hearing, that the individuals their own internal issues are not being addressed. Yes. So you have individuals who walk around with mental health issues, who have easy access to assault weapons that can fire rounds of bullets in seconds. That was changing. I think one of the things that's a positive that's working is that you do have more individuals who are working in communities, like Dr. Muhammad said, like the return offenders who are coming back and working with young people. That's really doing well. A lot of people working, previous offenders who are coming back and working with young people. That's really working well. But I think as you talk to people, the one thing that's really hurting the city is the access to guns. And these guns aren't coming from DC. These guns are coming from down south. They're coming from Georgia. They're coming from Florida, North Carolina, coming up 95. How is it that these guns can find their way into Washington, D.C. easily? No one seems to be able to even answer that question. The FBI has this war on drugs and what have you. They can stop drugs from coming into neighborhoods, but they can't stop automatic weapons from coming into neighborhoods. That's very interesting.
And to my point, as I said, we're talking certainly a different era of hundreds of homicides a year versus, as of this conversation, 69. Mm-hmm. And so why aren't we still seeing hundreds? Is it because of that we're no longer dealing with the kind of crack cocaine gang warfare that we had back in that time, and now it's the reasons for these homicides is different? Because again,
that's it, Harold. The reasons are different. Back then, you had people who drug territories. You had drug dealers protecting their territories. You had drug dealers who were taking out customers who weren't paying. I mean, it was all about business. I mean, that's what was fueling those killings. Today, it's not about business. Today, it's really about beef. Today, it's mostly about beefs that's fueling these killings. That's the difference. Back in the 80s, it was all about business, protecting my neighborhood, protecting my street corner from rival drug dealers. Today, it's more about these exchanges, these social media beefs that find their way out onto the street. That's what's really fueling these killings.
And thank you for reminding me about that, Keith, because one of the many heartbreaking stories that we've seen over the past couple of weeks is the 14-year-old girl who accidentally shot herself while doing a social media video, Dr. Muhammad. I am truly at a loss for words.
Technology. When we think about the differences that we're seeing now, specifically in crime and criminality, a lot of the pieces, interestingly enough, fall down to this persona and this image of individuals. And we got to go back to the double tap, the hearts, the emojis, and the likes. This all goes back to love. It goes back to acknowledgement. It goes back to being seen. It's screaming attention, right? When individuals are jumping on all the cars, they're running around and all of these press releases, it's like, yes, I am seen. This is not the way that you want to be seen, right? Like, I think it's important for us to acknowledge young individuals and really get down to the core of really how we're ultimately getting here. Back in the day, you had OGs, and even the OGs that were on the corners and hustlings, they would always give a good word. These are individuals that would help individuals across the street. There were certain codes of the street that acknowledge young individuals, old individuals. Many of these individuals are, for health reasons, no longer here, either incarcerated. All of the mentoring programs, you got to do a criminal background check. They want to take you, out of your community into McDonald's. No, these young people need to learn how to navigate in their own communities, right? These are small nuances that make huge differences. But when you really look at it, these are interpersonal relationships. Fighting over girls, shooting somebody over somebody liking your girl, where you're in love. How do you communicate that? How do you talk about it? These are things that you may get in school, but if you're pushed out or you're not there, that being able to socialize happens in action. And so we have to take those loud actions and begin allowing them to manifest in words and wisdom and intelligence. And that's only going to happen through love. It's only going to happen through wrapping your arms around young individuals and remembering what it was like to be that age, and using the experts, credible messengers, to be able to really get to the heart and the core of what's going on.
And Dr. Muhammad makes a big up point, real quick. The code. Harold, you asked me earlier what has changed. What Dr. Muhammad said, that has changed. The code on the street has changed. Women and children were off limits in terms of victims. And schools off limits.
Yes.
That any crime involving women, children, and schools off limits. That code of the street is now gone. That code no longer exists. And so that's also one of the things that changed. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. That's one of the things also that has changed. And what also Dr. Muhammad said is also very important. If young people don't get the attention from at home, they're going to get it in the street. And that's the bottom line. Young people are thriving for attention, and parents aren't home. They're working several jobs. Grandparents aren't home, what have you. And so these kids want attention. If they're not getting it at home, they're going to get it somewhere. And the street will be happy to give them that attention. It'll give them the attention by being involved in crime.
Keith, as a journalist, what role do you believe media coverage plays in the public's perception of crime in DC, and does it impact policy decisions? For example, we had the double homicide at the Jewish Museum. Mm-hmm. That received national coverage. The Pitts Place shooting and murder yesterday happened literally an hour or so after the chief held a press conference about weekend Memorial Day crime. And so just from coverage, it's like the chief talked about this, but the crime continues. This was it seemed to be an extension of the weekend. Your thoughts about the role that media plays in the perception?
Well, first of all, I will say this. Every summer in DC, crime spikes. It's a given. Violent crime spikes every summer in DC. Sadly, that's just people are outside more, and people are outside more, then people can get to their whoever they want to get at to by shooting. So that's a given. So it just happens to be Memorial Day weekend. Yes, we already expected crime to go up. I do think that as journalists, our job is to put a spotlight on issues and find trends in these issues. For example, we were covering a lot of stories about juvenile crime, and just recently, MPD decided to focus on juvenile crime by creating a task force that's supposed to be focused on juvenile crime. But we're seeing juvenile crime take off in the city. Our job is to say, look, this is happening in Washington, D.C. Yes, there are adults committing crime, but you have an alarming number of juveniles, carjackings, armed carjackings. What is MPD doing about it? And now MPD said, you know what? We're now going to create a task force to focus on juvenile crime. So our job is to, yes, tell a story about what happened and who these victims are. But our job as journalists is to really tell a broad, sweeping story, a trend story, that we have 4 or 5 cases that are all very similar and what happened. So when you have a trend type story, then, okay, Mayor Bowser or Chief Smith, you've got all these cases that all have a very similar factor to them: juveniles, armed carjacking, the type of gun. What is MPD doing about it? If the press is seeing this, you all have to be seeing that. So that's what I think our job as the press is to do, is to shed a light on trends within violent crime. It's to focus on specific cases, but then to step back and say, okay, what do these cases have in common? Mm-hmm. And then what is MPD doing about the commonality in these cases?
Mm-hmm. Dr. Muhammad, I'm going to let you have the last minute or so to answer, this question. When generational trauma and lack of support down through the generations is not working, what do you believe can?
I think education. Oftentimes individuals don't want to hear it, but the importance of oral history. When intergenerationally things are passed down, I think it's important for young individuals to be reminded of where they come from, who they are, ultimately what they can be. It's challenging in a school system where you don't see yourself. So now you're searching for attention. You're already out of the school system. You don't see yourself in the curriculum. Now you're in the streets and you're in the community. You don't see yourself through this gentrification, and now you're criminalized outside of your own school. You don't have these sort of pieces. I think being able to let individuals know that they didn't start in a space of detriment, that they held from kings and queens, that ultimately what they are succumbed to and the ways in which they are acting is not the only way, that there are individuals that see them, that love them, that understand, and there's help. There is help out there. Therapy is not weak, right? Being able to use examples and stories of individuals crying is a good thing and a cleansing. Picking up a gun, you can write something just as strong in a journal to get something off of your chest where you don't have to be succumbed to the reality of violence, right? Like, I really think that one of the things that I would say and do is to be able to give individuals real stories, give them this kind of historical landscape, not in a boring kind of way, but in a way that pulls them into the reality to understand that this is not it. This does not have to be the reality, that they can break that intergenerational cycle. And it's not weak. It's not soft. It's actually strong and resilient and king-like. I think trying to get into the minds of young individuals by going through their hearts. I think that's going to be the only way, and reminding them not only of their brilliance, but also the ways in which we could work as a team. I think it's very important to make sure that we're thinking about young individuals and incorporating them, even in the programs that we are creating for them after school and, in Banneker, and for all of these sort of initiatives, we are creating things around them, and that does not work. It doesn't work.
Can I just highlight one thing she said? Get into a young person's mind through their heart. That was deep, Dr. Muhammad. Thank you. That was good.
Because if you don't do it that way, if those stories aren't told that way, then the Keith Alexanders will be telling your story in the Washington Post and in other news media outlets, which is what we don't want. I have to end it there. Dr. Bahia Muhammad, Keith Alexander, always a pleasure to have you on the program. That is the Daily Drum for this Wednesday, May 28th. I'm Harold Fisher.